Okay, here we go. Hello to everyone watching from the future. This is the Intro to Figma workshop. Today, I'll be going over just general concepts of Figma and everything you'll need to know to get your project started. Okay, so show of hands, who has never used Figma before? I guess you can react with a hand emoji or something. Okay, cool. So that's great because this workshop is tailored to be very beginner friendly. First of all, we'll begin with some Figma basics with a tour of the platform, and then I'll throw out some terminology I'll be using throughout the workshop, just so we're on the same page and nobody's confused. Then I'll transition into kind of like a tips and tricks section. Just some of the things that I've picked up over the years that I've found made my design process a lot more efficient and more seamless. And we'll end with a follow-along demo where I'll be covering things like style libraries, creating components, and prototyping. So the more complex side of Figma. Also, feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Stop me at any points. You can unmute yourself or just pop your question into the chat. Okay, before I get started, I'll give a brief intro as to who I am. Hello, I'm Lena. I'm a second year in computer science, and I'm planning on minoring in visual arts. I'm the webmaster for girlCode and the Women in Computer Science Club. And I'm also a graphic designer for the UX Hub and Get Thrifty. So as you can tell, I'm pretty into design and web dev. I'm currently on co-op right now, but usually when I'm on campus, I spend a lot of time in the computer science building. So if you guys ever see me, feel free to say hi. Oh, also forgot to change the slide, whoops. I'm also anything The Office related. I'm an encyclopedia for it, so feel free to quiz me. Cool, that's me. Let's get started with the technical stuff now. So here I'll give a brief tour of the workspace for Figma. So as you can see in this diagram, Figma is roughly divided into 4 sections. We have the toolbar at the top. We have the layers panel to the left, canvas in the center, and properties panel to the right. So for the toolbar, this is kind of where you'll find your tools that you'll be using. If you've used any other digital art or design app, it kind of is the same thing, except as you notice with Figma, the selection of tools is definitely a lot smaller. And I think this is because Figma does a really good job at keeping its workspace clean and only giving you the tools necessary that you need, instead of bloating it with a bunch of tools that you might never touch. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just be going over a couple of them. The first is this, which is the move tool. This is a tool that I'm on most of the time to kind of like move around the Figma, to move stuff, and to, I guess, look at things. This tool doesn't really edit any shapes or any elements. It just has the ability to change their position. So 90% of the time, I'm probably on this tool. Next tool is the frames tool. This one's a bit more complex. This is the tool that you would always want to start your project off with. It's really good convention to put any design, let's say like web page or app screen, into a frame first. I'll get into the difference between a frame and a group later on in the workshop. But just for now, know that you would always want to put your designs into a frame, not just having it loose around in Figma. So to create a frame, there's 2 ways. First, you can just click and drag anywhere on the canvas and create a frame that is customizable to you. You can choose the dimensions, the height, the width. Or the second way, which is the way I typically prefer, is through the properties panel, because Figma actually gives you a bunch of presets for different frames that you can choose from. For example, there's phone, tablet, desktop, there's a bunch. Typically, the frames that I use the most are the desktop frame and the phone frame over here, because I mostly just create websites and mobile apps. I usually only use the desktop, sorry, not desktop, the Figma frames, because they give certain specifications and dimensions that I typically want to stick to. So Figma is really great for that. The next tool I want to go over is the comment tool. This is a great tool if you're working with a bunch of people and you kind of want to keep your thoughts clean and your work process clean. It works like any other comment tool. Basically, you pick a spot where you want to put the comment, and you simply just type whatever you want. And you can press send. It'll create a tiny anchor comment where you want to place it. And if you wanted to resolve it, you just click this resolve button. So yeah, pretty straightforward. Oh yes, one last thing I wanted to mention was this duplicate tool. You'll find it over here. Hopefully most of you guys went through the pre-workshop handbook and have already duplicated this file, but just in case you guys haven't, I'll put another link into the chat just so you can do that right now, because this workshop has a bit of a follow along demo at the very end, and it's useful to have it duplicated so you can edit the file. Okay, here you go. And to duplicate it, simply just go to the toolbar and click on duplicate. Great. Next, we have a layers panel. And honestly, this is the panel that I typically use the least. This basically shows you a directory of what your project looks like. It shows you all your groups. If you click into it, you can see all the elements inside of the group. Typically, it's good practice to keep your directory pretty clean and organized by grouping things properly and naming things properly. But I wouldn't say it's the most important, especially when you're under a time crunch, like a hackathon. I wouldn't put it as my first priority. One thing you can do with the layers panel is click into any shape and select it. But typically, I just like doing this through the canvas like this. But one really good thing about the layers panel is the lock tool, which you can see when you hover over any element here. What this essentially does, if you activate it, is it locks it in place. For example, let's choose this as an example. Okay, so here I have just locked this title, so I won't be able to actually edit it. This is really good for if you've created something and you know for sure that you want to put it there and you don't want to accidentally edit it or move it, you can simply just lock it in the layers panel. And yeah, I'm going to unlock that, and now I'm able to move it. Well, that's the layers panel. Next, we'll go over the properties panel. This is the panel that you'll definitely be using the most, because all of the design properties and anything you could possibly want would be on this panel. For example, if I click into this shape, you'll be able to see that there's a bunch of align options. I can change the X and Y axis of the bubble. I can change the width. I can change the colors over here. I can add strokes to it if I want, add a bunch of effects, all that jazz. So when you're editing or designing something, you'll probably find what you need in this panel. There's also a prototype and inspect tab, but I'll go into more depth into those tabs later on in the workshop. Great, and last but not least is the canvas. And this, of course, is where you'll be putting your work and your designs. One good thing to note is that you shouldn't treat this like a regular traditional canvas where you kind of zoom out and use the whole thing. Like, for example, I see a lot of people like using it fully zoomed out with like their text super big because they think that this is like a full canvas. Try not to do that because Figma designed this canvas to be more of like an endless workspace. So what you would want to do is you would kind of pick a spot and lay out your designs next to each other. And yeah, that's a basic tour. Does anyone have any questions so far? Great. I'll move on to the tips and tricks. Okay, so as you can see, the basics of Figma are pretty intuitive, but I think the real value in Figma comes from when you start actually learning all the shortcuts and workarounds and get more used to the space. Because if you know how to use Figma properly, the design process becomes seamless and very efficient. So here are some tips and tricks that I wish I would have known when I first started out, because it would have saved me a lot of time and effort. So first things first, the most important trick I would say is to really know your shortcuts and hotkeys well. Let's see. So you can find a whole list of shortcuts by going to this question mark at the bottom right and clicking on keyboard shortcuts. And here you can find a pretty great resource for all the shortcuts that Figma has to offer, sectioned off into categories. So if you're ever trying to find a specific shortcut, you can probably find it over here. I typically usually have my left hand always on the keyboard using shortcuts. For example, I never really use the toolbar with my mouse anymore. If I want something, for example, the rectangle tool, I would just hit R. If I want V, I would want the move tool. It just really speeds up that design process, so I don't have to drop what I'm doing with my mouse on the canvas to move over to the toolbar. Here are some, I guess, most of my commonly used shortcuts. The first one is the move tool, which I mentioned before. You just press V. I'm on it right now. And you just simply use this to move things around. The next is a group function. So if you click Control or Command G, depending on if you're using Mac or Windows, you'll be able to group certain items. So for example, if I wanted to group this with this, I would just select both of them like this, and I would simply press Command G. And what grouping does is it treats multiple elements like one single element. So I would just click this once and I would be able to move them all together. This is really great if you have any intricate designs or patterns that have a bunch of basic elements in them. If you group it, you can treat it as one element and you won't accidentally move like one piece of it. Next is the scale tool. This is pretty useful if you're trying to ever resize groups that have text in them. For example, if I take this logo right here, and let's say I want to make it bigger. If I just simply try to resize it on the move tool, as you can see, it resizes the SVG, but not the text. And this is because I'm actually resizing the text box and not the font size itself. So to prevent this, you can simply press K on your keyboard, which brings you to the scale tool, which you can see by the double arrows on my cursor. And then you can resize it, and that should keep its proportions clear and nice. And if you want to exit, just simply press V, and you're back to normal. Great, and the last one is shift, and basically literally anything. There's a bunch of use cases for this. This sounds kind of dumb, but from my experience moving around from design platform to design platform, you intuitively begin to think that if you're ever doing a task or command with the mouse and it's not exactly doing what you want, try hitting shift and it'll probably fix it. For example, if I want to create a perfect square, I would first click on the rectangle tool. And then I would kind of notice like, oh, Figma doesn't really snap to a square. I kind of have to eyeball it. But if I did want a perfect square, I can click shift and that automatically snaps it to a square. The same thing applies to ellipses. I can create circles. And let's say I wanted to move this rectangle or this square only in the up direction. I simply hold down shift while I'm moving, and it only allows me to move up or down, which is pretty nice. Let's say I have a rectangle. If I wanted to resize, I would simply hold down shift and it would keep its original dimensions. I can also hold down shift for creating straight lines with the pen tool and selecting multiple things. So basically, as you can see, there's a bunch of uses for the shift. So when in doubt, try hitting shift. It'll probably change something. The next shortcut is the deep select. I've put this on a separate slide because there is a tiny exercise for you guys to do if you wanted to. So deep select has to do with elements that are in nested layers or nested groups. So for example, I talked about groups before, but groups are basically combinations of different elements together. And you can actually make groups of groups and groups of groups of groups. And to access all the elements inside each group, you have to click into it. So for example, with this design, I have to click into this. And as you can see here, it leads me to group 45. I have to click in again, it leads me to group 44, click in again, leads me to Figma logo. I click in one last time, and then I can access anything in this logo. And, you know, sometimes that's a bit tedious. I don't want to have to do all that clicking. So what you can do is you simply just hit Command or Control on your keyboard and hover over the item that you want to select and select it. And that automatically selects it for you. So you guys can go ahead and try it on your own Figma files if you would like. Great. Moving on is auto layout. Now this is a bit harder to understand, I guess. It's a bit more complex, but it is a really useful and powerful tool. So auto layout basically is a way of Figma automatically spacing and giving padding to a certain number of elements. And this only works on a frame. So for example, if I wanted to, I guess, align this frame of different circles better, I could press, I could select the frame, I could press Shift A, and that automatically fixes everything and makes sure all the padding and spacing is even and nice. And this is really good because this allows for really responsive layouts. For example, if let's say I wanted to add another circle into this, I can simply just drag it in and Figma would resize it itself without me having to, make this frame bigger, making space, making sure all the individual circles fit in. It's just a really fast way of making sure that everything fits in its place and everything is where it needs to be. To customize this, you can click on it and head over to the design panel. In auto layouts, you can change the orientation of it. You can increase padding in this way and this way. So yeah, it's a pretty versatile way of working. If you guys wanted to, you could also try this exercise as well. Great. Moving on is mass renaming. Now, as I mentioned before, renaming things and keeping your directory organized isn't a main priority, but it definitely is nice to have things named in a certain way so it's easier to find them. But it is a pain to kind of click into each one of them and change them over in the layers panel. So what Figma created was mass renaming. If you select all of the items that you want to rename, you can, hold down Shift and select them, or click and drag, and then press down Control or Command R. It brings up this nice renaming tab with a bunch of different functionalities. For example, let's say I wanted to name all these squares square 1, square 2, square 3, square 4, square 5. I would simply just type in square as the base name, and then I would choose descending or ascending, depending on what I want. Let's say I want ascending. In the preview section, you can see that these are going to be labeled square 1, square 2, square 3, and I'm happy with that. Once I'm happy with the naming, I can hit rename. And as you can see in the layers panel, all of these squares are now renamed to that convention. So yeah, it's just a really good way of keeping your directory clean, but it's not necessarily like a must-have. Next is the CSS function, which I found very useful. I only found out about this, I want to say a year ago, but it's really great for when you're migrating your design from Figma into code. So you can find this property by heading over to the properties panel on the right and hitting the inspect. Now, if you select any object that you want to get CSS from, for example, let's say we're interested in the CSS text. We want to see how we can replicate it. If we select it and scroll all the way down, Figma actually generates CSS code for you. So you can simply just copy paste this into your CSS file, and that would create this essentially, as long as you have your framing and everything set up properly. But as we can see here, setting text to a gradient isn't as simple as just setting the color of the text to a gradient. You actually have to make the background a gradient and then clip the text onto the background, which is, something that you wouldn't usually think to do, but Figma just provides it for you, which is great. So you can just take this and paste it in. It also gives great comments, so you can keep your code nice and clean. Great, and the last tip or trick is icons. So I get this question a lot about where I get my icons from. I feel like beginners typically usually like to take their icons individually off of Googling by Googling whatever icon they want. And I find that this method isn't great for a couple reasons. First one, usually it's just really hard to find things with a transparent background. Sometimes it'll be a JPEG with a transparent looking background that markets itself as a PNG, but really is a JPEG. Second, you typically want to be working with vectors, not rasterized files in Figma, just because vectors are a lot easier to resize. and it's just typically harder to find vector assets on the web. And third, if you find your icons individually, most times they won't fit together nicely. Some of them will have a different styling, different strokes, different colors. This doesn't really fit together, right? So what I like to do is I like to find libraries. Now you can do this in two ways. You can do it through plugins. I skipped this in the toolbar tour before, but if you head over to the toolbar and click on this icon, this will be your plugins page. And there's a bunch of Figma plugins. I definitely recommend you guys looking into plugins if you guys have some free time, because there's definitely some cool ones out there that'll save you guys a bunch of time. But yeah, if you search up icons, there's a bunch of plugins that come up. For example, if I click on this and I run it, I get access to all of these icons for free directly in Figma. So let's say I wanted this plain icon. I simply just drag and drop into my canvas. And if I zoom in, there's a plain icon. I can change it because it is a vector to any color I want. And yeah, they're pretty cool and pretty customizable. And the second way I get icons, and the way I prefer, is through something called Font Awesome. Let me demo this for you guys. So I'll go into design and hit the font. Okay, let's do this. And let's say I type in some random brand, like Discord. It automatically senses the keyword and it turns it into an icon, which is pretty great because it's treated as a font. So you can do anything that fonts can do. You can add a stroke, you can change the color, add effects. It's pretty cool. You can find the whole repository for Font Awesome icons just by searching the Font Awesome website. As you can see here, they have like 20,000 icons to choose from. So that's pretty cool. All you need to do is find an icon that you like. For example, let's say you want a settings icon. You can simply just type in the keyword settings and it'll give us a bunch of different options for icons that can represent settings. Let's say I wanted this one. I would copy in the key phrase and I would paste it in here and go to the correct setting, hopefully. And there we go. We get a gear. I typically like this one a lot more because there's just a bunch of more icons to choose from. And it's just a lot easier once it is text. So yeah, those are the tips and tricks. Do you guys have any questions so far? If not, I will, yes. So it's kind of just like any personal font you would use. You just have to download it on your local computer and then Figma would have access to it and you'd be able to use it that way. To download it, I think you just go to their website and if you go to start, there should be a font kit you can download. Yep. Any more questions? How do we assign the settings to the, oh, okay. So basically what I did before was that this gear icon is only available in solid. Let's see. So if I go back to search and I go gear, what we found was a solid one. So if I went to the regular, it wouldn't do anything, right? And you have to kind of choose the version that you would want as well. For example, I used Font Awesome 5 a couple years ago, and then I upgraded to Font Awesome 6 because they made a new release. So Font Awesome 5 doesn't have this gear, but Font Awesome 6 does. So yeah, that's how you assign settings. Great. Let's move on to the follow along demo. This is where you'll probably want to pull out your own Figma files, because this is just a lot more interactive. Through this follow along demo, I'll be going over the style guides and libraries, their benefits, colors, libraries, and text style libraries. I'll also be going over components, how to create them, how to maintain them, and how to use them properly. And I'll also be going over some prototyping stuff. So connecting frames together and transitions. And if we have time, I can also show a brief animation using Figma as well. Okay, I'm going to head over to the follow along demo section, which is just on the next page. And here you should be able to see 4 different screens, 3 of which are filled in, and the 4th isn't. It has a transparent background, and we would also call this a overlay. I'll get more into detail about that later on. Anyways, let's start off with the first screen. As you can see here, it has a bit of work to do. The first things first, let's insert a graphic. Let's delete the gray square and the text. And I guess this is an opportunity to explore the Figma tools. For example, the shape tool, pen tool, any of the design properties. Just create any graphic or logo or drawing that you want. I'll give about 3 minutes-ish. I'll create something in the meantime. Let's say I wanted to do a rectangle. You guys can create your own designs, or you can follow me as well, up to you. I'll create a rectangle. I want to round out the edges, which I can do by clicking this dot on the edge. It rounds out all of the edges. If I wanted to change only one of them, I would head over to the design panel. I would click on independent corners, and I would be able to change it here. Let's say 10 for this one. Okay, we have a shape on there. Let's make it look better. Let's add in a stroke. Let's put the width to 10. And let's choose a color. So let's say I wanted this specific gradient. I really like the gradient, and I want this design to match. I can't really do that well with the dropper tool because it is a gradient and it only will select whatever color it's on. So what we can do is we can create a name for it in our style libraries. So to do that, we would want to select the object that has the color or gradient that we want. We would move over to the design tab in the properties panel. And right here, we can see 4 dots, which basically just stands for the style library. We click on it, and then we press the plus button to create a new style. We add it in here, we name it, I'll call it blue gradients. Description, let's say that this is an accent color. Cool. If you press show more options, you can kind of tweak and edit it, change the opacity, whatever you want. But I'm pretty happy with the way that this looks now. So I'll hit create style. And now I can simply just press the style library while selecting the object that I want to change, and hit blue gradient. And that gives me the exact gradient that this object has, which is pretty cool. Let's do the same exact thing for the pink gradient. So we have all the gradients we want. Same thing, style icon, plus, name it pink gradient. Description, let's call it accent color 2. Create that style just in case I want to use it in the future. But for now, I'll continue designing this to make it clear. And on the inside, I can experiment with some pen tool action. So for anyone who isn't familiar with using pen tools, it basically just is a bunch of anchors connected together with lines that you can edit using handles. So there you go. There's an example of a really poorly drawn out circle. But if I wanted to go back and edit it, I can by going to the move tool and editing these anchors to kind of edit and I guess move everything to make it look more like a circle. Or I could create something completely different. I could create, I don't know, an oblong bean. And this is treated as exactly like a shape would be treated. So I can add a fill to it. Let's do pink gradients. I can add a stroke. We can do white. And we can also change the opacity of colors. So let's do 20% here. Yeah. There's this blank space here, so let's go in. We can add a star if we would like, and use the style libraries again to get pink. Cool. That's our graphic. Doesn't look the best, but you know, we can always spend more time and edit it later. But for now, let's move on. Here is insert text. This was originally meant to mimic a startup screen or a loading screen. So we can put whatever text we want. I'll just put loading pages here. You can choose to put whatever you want. Okay, cool. This screen seems like it's pretty much done. Let's move on to this screen. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm kind of noticing that the text for the heading is a bit small. It doesn't really match up with the other screen. So what we can do, if we wanted the exact styling of this header, we can make this into our library as well. So how we do that would be pretty much the same way as the color libraries. We would click on the element, and we go to the style icon, click the plus, and we would simply name it to what we want. So let's call this demo heading. Next, we can add a description. Let's just say basic heading. Cool. Now I've created a style. And we can then apply that style to the text by clicking on styles and then demo heading. Also, feel free to let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow. So yeah, I'll be moving on. So this edit text seems fine. We typically don't really want overlapping objects, so I'm just going to move this slightly out of the way. So it just makes this edit text a little bit more readable. And then we can move on to the editing of the main component. So as we can see here, we kind of have a blank image. this grid pattern is just what Figma default puts in a image that doesn't have an actual image yet. So we can add an image by clicking the object that we would want, heading over to the design panel and clicking fill. And as you can see here, there's a bunch of different fills for shapes. We can fill any shape that we would want. There's solid, which is a basic one color. There's linear gradients. There's radial gradients, angular, diamond. There's a bunch you can experiment with. But for now, let's just add an image. I have pre-downloaded a image of a nice jacket you put in. You can put in any image that you want. This exercise is mostly just showing you guys how to put in an image. After you've done that, you can move on to editing the text. I'll give you guys about like 1 or 2 minutes to edit this. But yeah, basically just put in whatever text you see fit. I'll say that this is $80. It's a reasonable price for a jacket, I think. Color is like, I would say a gray-ish blue. Size, let's call that a small. An item would be upper jacket. And I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to make those changes on your own Figma file. And one thing you should note, just thinking about it from a user's perspective, you should always keep in mind text hierarchy and the hierarchy of information when you're designing anything, whether it be a website or an app. So for example, you would want to put the most important information at the top or accent it by making the text bigger, having it be bold or italics, or having it be an accent color. In this case, we would want to put this items property at the top because that's probably what the user would want to see first. They wouldn't really care about the price or the color or the size if it wasn't the item that they were looking for. So yeah, just keep those things in mind when you're beginning your design process. Just make sure to think about it from the user's perspective and if it makes sense for them. And just to note, I was easily able to move that all the way up without touching these because this is in an auto layout, which is a trick we learned in the previous section. Yeah, it automatically just keeps the spacing the exact same. So I didn't have to drag all of these all the way down and drag this all the way to the top. Cool. I think that is it for editing this screen. Let's move on to the next, which is the component screen. But first, let's change this header to follow the same style as the others. There we go. And okay, let's see. What's one thing that is not so great about this button? Feel free to type it in the chat or unmute. What's one thing that probably isn't good design-wise? Exactly. You can't really read it. And the point of a button is to be read. So we definitely don't want that. So let's change it. So as you remember before, we created these color styles in our library, which means that we're just easily able to access the color at any point by going into style and choosing blue gradient. And there we go. After doing that, that makes it easily more legible. Great, so that is fixed. Now let's get into making it an actual component. This is good for when you have many of the same elements copy and pasted around in your app or project. For example, like nav bars or icons or buttons. Those are things that are recycled and reused a lot. And let's say if you wanted to change the color of a button, you don't necessarily want to be changing the color of it in every single instance. What components does is it allows you to just change one instance, which is the main component, and that will change all of its children or instances. I'll show you how it is done. So first, let's make this a component. We can click on it and then hit the components button, which is at the top in the toolbar. We know that this is a component because over at the layers panel, we can see that it is a filled diamond and it is purple. Now, if we were to, let's say, make copies of these, copy and paste, this would be an instance of a component. It shows up as a unfilled diamond in the layers panel. So if we wanted to, we can change this color back to pink. Still really isn't legible, but it will also change this as well, which is pretty cool. So let's change it back for now. And let's add these buttons throughout our little design. We do it by pasting and moving it to where we want. I want a button in the first page. Let's label this next. I want another one in the second page. I'll insert this here. Notice how I didn't have to resize anything because of the auto layout. Also label this next. And I want this button to lead to the notification. So I guess do open note. Cool. So then if we ever wanted to, I don't know, change the color of the font to something else, let's say red, it'll all change red, black, it'll all change black. Great. So those are components. Usually you want to keep your main component somewhere pretty noticeable and safe. Usually I like to put a border around it and just label it as components, just so I don't get it lost. Because if you end up losing your main component, you kind of don't really know which one to switch or to change to make all the edits to. Like for example, if I switch this, it's only going to switch that one. So you want to make sure you always keep track of your main components. Cool. That's components. Now let's get on to prototyping. So prototyping essentially isn't really a design aspect. It's more kind of like gluing and piecing your designs together to create something that's like semi-usable. It isn't really like fully the app, but it's a prototype basically. So the basic and most easiest form of prototyping is just switching between screens. So let's say we wanted to add some functionality to this button. We wanted to make this button so that if you click on it, it would move to the next screen, this screen. What I would do is click on the button, head over to the prototypes panel, and add an interaction. Then from there, I would do on click because that's what I want. There's also a bunch of other different events or actions, but for this one, I just want to do on click. Then I would do navigate to, because I want to navigate to a screen, and I'll click the correct screen. This frame is labeled item screen, so that is what I'll want to click. And as you can see, Figma kind of gives you this arrow pointing from this button all the way to the screen. And this only shows up in the prototyping panel. So let's say if you wanted to go back into design mode, you don't always have these annoying arrows in your way. It only shows up in prototyping. Great. So let's prototype the other buttons the exact same way. Click on it, add an interaction, on click, navigate to, and then this one would want to navigate to components. And we would do that. Cool. And let's say we wanted to animate the back buttons as well. We would simply do the exact same thing. We can do that right now. We can add an interaction, navigate to, and this one wants to go back to this. And I'll do that for the rest of the back buttons. Cool. So we kind of have our little prototype here. We can play it by clicking on the flow. It just takes a couple seconds to load. But as you can see here, if you click on anywhere on the screen, it'll highlight what you can click in blue. You can go back and forth and back all the way to styling, etc. So yeah, that's basically your simple prototype. It kind of looks like your app has a bit of functionality, but if we want to get more complex with it, we can also do animations. So let's try animating a notification pop-up. To do that, it's basically the same thing. It's just there's just a bit more settings to play with. We would want to, I guess we would want to make this the open notification button. So we would click on it, add an interaction, and on click, we would want this to, instead of navigate to, we would want it to open an overlay, because this is technically what the notification is called. We open an overlay, and what this does, it just opens a layer on top of the current screen instead of navigating to a whole new screen. So open overlay, and we would want to open the prototypes. And this automatically gives us a bunch of new features we can play with. I want this to be centered. I want it to close when clicking outside, and to animate, I want it to move in from the top. And Figma gives you basically a preview of what each thing looks like. I want it to move in from the top, because that's usually how notifications work. From here, you can choose your animation kind of flare. If you've ever done animation before, it's basically just like tells it how fast to go in and out. Usually I do ease in, ease out. That's just my favorites. You can also customize it to how you'd want. There's also some fancy ones here, but you know, I'm pretty simple. I'll do ease in and ease out. Cool. So if we play this, hopefully we'll be able to see the notification. So yeah, it pops up, I click out, it goes away. And yeah, that's prototyping. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. Well, that concludes this workshop. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully now you guys have a better understanding of what Figma is and have a general idea of where to start designing your project. Feel free to use these slides in the slides and info section. It's kind of like a resource during your hackathon. I tried to include as much information as precisely as I could. But if you do have any questions about UX or Figma during the hackathon, feel free to reach out to one of the mentors or put your message into the Discord chat in the girlCode server. I'll be monitoring it pretty frequently throughout the hackathon, so hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions there. Or honestly, when in doubt, go to Google. Google will be your best friend. Figma has a really big community and a bunch of really nice documentation. So if you ever have an issue, it's most likely that someone else has had that issue as well, and it was already solved by someone at Figma. So yeah, good luck to you guys at the hackathon. I'm sure you guys will do amazing. Have fun, and don't forget to sleep the night before. Have a good rest of your day or night. Bye.